The film begins with a rocket returning from space. It had been on a mission to conduct research on forms of life beyond Earth. Scientists on board had collected samples of alien organisms called symbiotes. During the rocket's return to Earth, it experiences a technical malfunction, causing it to crash violently onto the Earth's surface, landing in Malaysia. The crash causes a massive explosion, resulting in the death of the scientists aboard. However, one of the symbiote samples escapes and begins to move. When the rescue team arrives at the crash site, they find one astronaut still alive and transport him by ambulance to the hospital. During the journey, it becomes apparent that the symbiote has infiltrated the astronaut's body. Suddenly, the astronaut wakes up in a state of frenzy and attacks the paramedics, causing the ambulance to overturn. The symbiote then transfers to one of the rescue team members, takes control of her, and proceeds on its way while healing her injuries. The symbiote is shown holding an emblem of a company called Life. Several months after the incident, we are introduced to a journalist named Eddie Brock. At that time, his wife wakes him up because of his work commitments before leaving for her job at the Life Corporation. Eddie then meets his boss, Jack, who assigns him to interview Drake, the head of Life Corporation, the company responsible for the crashed rocket. Drake had arranged the interview with Jack to polish his public image, as his reputation had suffered after the rocket crash. The interview's goal was to assure the public that Drake's rockets were safe and reliable. Eddie initially refuses to do the interview because he is a journalist with integrity who does not want to deceive people. However, Jack insists, reminding Eddie of his popularity. Reluctantly, Eddie agrees out of respect for Jack. That evening, Eddie waits until his wife is asleep, then accesses her computer. He discovers confidential files related to Drake's company. Since his wife is an attorney for Life Corporation, she had some of these files. From these documents, Eddie learns that Drake is conducting secret experiments on cancer patients. The next morning, Drake is at his company, speaking to a group of children about the goal of his corporation to find life in space. Eddie arrives for the interview, and instead of asking about the rockets, he confronts Drake with questions about his human experiments, which result in deaths. Drake refuses to continue the interview, throws the microphone, and orders his security guards to remove Eddie from the building. Jack confronts Eddie, asking for his source of information about the experiments. Eddie refuses to disclose that he got the information from his wife, simply saying he feels Drake is untrustworthy. Jack replies, "We can't rely on feelings in our work. We provide people with facts." As a consequence, Eddie is fired from his job, leaving him shocked as he hadn't anticipated such an outcome. It turns out that Eddie's wife was also fired from Life Corporation because of her association with him. Enraged, she takes off her wedding ring and gives it to Eddie, believing he used her. She then leaves him. Thus, Eddie loses both his wife and his job in a single day. On the other hand, Drake possesses 3 symbiote samples that arrive from space aboard the rocket and is aware that the 4th sample has escaped. This symbiote is controlling the woman who attacked the paramedics and continues to dominate her. The symbiote directs the woman to a fish market, where she devours a live sea creature. The vendor becomes furious with her, prompting the symbiote to transform her hand into a weapon, killing the vendor. As people gather to confront her, the symbiote produces weapons from her body and eliminates them instantly. The symbiote then transfers to the body of an elderly woman. 6 months later, Drake continues conducting experiments with the symbiote samples, attempting to merge them with living organisms. He tests a symbiote on a rabbit, as a symbiote's survival requires bonding with a genetically compatible host. The fusion between the symbiote and the rabbit succeeds. Drake decides to proceed with human trials, despite objections from his assistant, Dora, who suggests slowing down and studying the symbiotes further. Drake ignores her warnings and orders the experiments to begin. Meanwhile, Eddie is living a difficult life after his career and personal life collapse. He cannot afford his apartment rent and spends time drinking in a bar. He watches an old interview of Drake on television, gets angry, and leaves the bar. He passes by a homeless woman, Maria, who lives near his home. Later, he enters a store owned by his neighbor. Suddenly, a thief storms in, points a gun at the store owner, and demands the usual goods he takes for free. Eddie feels helpless unable to intervene. Eddie returns to his apartment and unsuccessfully searches for a job. He sits on the floor, frustrated, while the loud music from his neighbor's apartment irritates him. He feels angry but lacks the courage to confront his neighbor. At Life Corporation, Drake brings in a poor man to attempt a symbiote merger. Initially, it seems to work, but the genetic incompatibility soon becomes evident. The volunteer suffers severe convulsions and dies. Drake then orders another volunteer to be brought in. Feeling guilty, Dora tracks down Eddie and meets him at the store. She introduces herself and tells him she works for Life Corporation. She asks for his help, but he refuses upon learning she is connected to Drake. She follows him and reveals that his accusations against Drake were correct. He is conducting lethal experiments on poor people. She explains that she initially believed these experiments would help cure cancer. Eddie replies, "If you have evidence, report it to the police." She responds that she can't because she fears for her children, as Drake is a dangerous man with significant influence. Eddie, disheartened, says, "I lost my job and my wife because of that man, and I'm behind on my rent. Be careful. He could ruin your life just like he ruined mine. Find someone else to help you." He then walks away. Eddie passes by the new home where and now lives. She is married to a wealthy doctor named Dan. Eddie greets Anne and her husband. Dan leaves them to talk and goes inside the house. Eddie is shocked to learn that and got married, as he didn't know about it, and begins asking her many questions. And asks, "Why did you come here?" Eddie replies, "Because I miss you, and I can't believe we broke up. I had to come and try to fix things between us." She responds, "That's impossible. We can't get back together." She then leaves him and enters the house. Eddie walks down the street, dejected, suffocating under the weight of his failed life and desperate to do something meaningful. He meets Dora and decides to help her expose Drake's actions. Dora takes Eddie to Life Corporation, explaining along the way that Drake has acquired alien organisms called symbiotes. These organisms need to bond with a living host to survive. Otherwise, they die. Drake believes merging humans with symbiotes will lead to a major breakthrough, but he doesn't realize how dangerous this process is. As they talk, a security guard approaches. Dora sneaks Eddie into the lab and locks the door behind him to distract the guard. Eddie starts recording what's happening in the lab and notices that one of the symbiotes has already died. He then sees a woman imprisoned and asking for help. It's Maria, the homeless woman he often saw near his home. Eddie tries to help her, but the alarm goes off. He breaks the door, and Maria attacks him, revealing that a symbiote is inside her. Triggered by the alarm, the symbiote transfers from Maria to Eddie, and she collapses. Eddie escapes the lab before the guards arrive. On his way out, he encounters the guards and manages to evade them with surprising skill, breaking doors and metal fences as he flees into the woods. The guards fire at him, but he remains unharmed. He crashes into trees, breaking them without injury. Stunned by his new strength, he climbs a tall tree at incredible speed without realizing how he did it. The guards fail to find him and retreat. Eddie returns home, feeling an overwhelming hunger. He eats ravenously, even picking up discarded chicken from the trash. He looks in the mirror and is shocked to see his distorted face, but he regains control after a moment. He goes to a restaurant where and is sitting with Dan. He joins them and shows in the photos he took in the lab. Suddenly, the symbiote takes over Eddie, and he begins eating food from other people's plates without realizing it. He jumps into a fish tank and devours a live crab, shocking Anne and Dan. Dan takes Eddie to the clinic and places him in an MRI machine for a scan. When the machine starts, Eddie experiences severe convulsions as the symbiote reacts to the magnetic waves. Dan shuts off the machine before the scan is complete, realizing that the symbiote and Eddie would have died if it continued. Eddie quickly gets up and leaves the clinic. Meanwhile, the symbiote moves from the elderly woman to a young girl at the airport. The girl holds a ticket to America, allowing the symbiote to travel there. At Life Corporation, Drake learned that someone had broken into the lab and ordered the guards to investigate. The guards quickly discovered Dora's involvement. Drake confronted Dora privately and asked her who took the symbiote. She refused to answer, so he tried to deceive her, claiming that the symbiote harms its host and that she needed to tell him the person's identity to save them. Believing him, Dora revealed that the person was Eddie. Drake was furious upon learning Eddie was involved. Meanwhile, Eddie was on a bus when the symbiote inside him said, "I'm hungry." Eddie started acting strangely, attracting the attention of the passengers. He went to prepare some food and called Anne, who informed him that Dan had discovered a strange organism inside his body, the source of his current troubles. Eddie hung up the call with Anne. At that moment, his neighbor was playing loud music, annoying the symbiote. Eddie knocked on his neighbor's door and asked him to turn down the volume, but the neighbor refused. The symbiote roared at the neighbor, terrifying him into immediate compliance. Hours later, Drake's men arrived at Eddie's apartment, pointing their weapons at him. Eddie raised his hands in fear, but the symbiote said, "Don't be a coward. I'll handle these men." The symbiote attacked Drake's men with tremendous power, using its abilities to overpower them. Eddie tried to escape, but the men pursued him. Drake watched the footage of the fight and felt a surge of excitement, seeing that the symbiote had finally bonded successfully with a human. Eddie jumped on his motorcycle to flee, but Drake's men sent drones to pursue him. The bullets had no effect, as the symbiote intelligently protected Eddie. He dodged the attacks, but 2 cars boxed him in. The symbiote shattered the glass and took control of the bike's steering to guide Eddie out of danger. However, another vehicle crashed into him, breaking several bones in his body. One of Drake's men tried to capture Eddie, but the symbiote immediately healed him and enveloped his body, transforming him into a large, terrifying alien creature. He grabbed one man by the neck and ate another man's brain. The police arrived, prompting the symbiote to leap into the water to escape, resurfacing on the shore later. Eddie was shocked to find his body fully healed. The symbiote introduced itself, saying, "I am Venom." It explained that Drake was planning to launch a rocket to its home planet to bring more symbiotes to Earth. And if that happened, these creatures would devour humanity. Venom asked Eddie to cooperate, and Eddie agreed. Meanwhile, the girl hosting the other symbiote arrived in America and was searching for Eddie, but found the police surrounding his street. She called him and asked where he was. He told her he was heading to his old workplace and asked her to stay away, but she didn't listen. Eddie climbed the building where he used to work, moving like Spider-Man. A plane flew overhead, emitting a loud noise that weakened Venom. Eddie reverted to his human form and fell, but Venom saved him at the last moment. Eddie broke into the company, leaving behind his phone, which contained the lab photos, along with a message for his former boss: "Do the right thing." Venom urged Eddie to jump off the building, but Eddie refused, opting to take the elevator instead. Upon reaching the ground, he found himself surrounded by police pointing their weapons at him. Venom reappeared, and the police opened fire, but the bullets had no effect. Venom attacked the officers and nearly bit off one of their heads, but appeared just in time. Eddie returned to his human form and left with Anne. "I need help," Eddie told her. She took him to her car to get him to the hospital, telling him that Dan would perform another MRI scan. Venom panicked and said, "Anything but the MRI." Eddie warned, and to avoid anything that emits high-frequency waves, as it would harm Venom. Anne, shocked, didn't argue much. When they arrived at the hospital, Dan told Eddie that the organism inside him was consuming his organs and that he would slowly die. Venom grew angry at Dan for uncovering this secret and grabbed him by the neck, and exploited Venom's weakness to high-pitched sounds and activated a device that emitted a powerful noise. Venom writhed in pain and separated from Eddie's body. Trapped in a room, Venom tried to escape through a ventilation shaft. Eddie, furious upon discovering that Venom had been consuming his organs and killing others, left the hospital and walked away. Taking advantage of the chaos, Venom escaped through the vent and bonded with a dog. As Eddie left the hospital, Drake's men appeared, captured him, and took him to Drake's lab. Meanwhile, the dog with Venom headed toward Anne. Around the same time, the girl hosting the other symbiote arrived at Drake's lab. The symbiote inside her attacked Drake, transferring itself to him. This symbiote, known as Riot, was aware of Drake's plan to launch a rocket to bring more symbiotes to Earth. Riot decided to bond with Drake to fulfill this goal. Drake confronted Eddie after learning that Eddie had separated from Venom. He demanded to know Venom's location, but Eddie denied knowing. Enraged, Drake released Riot, and Eddie was shocked to see that Drake had a symbiote. Drake decided to dispose of Eddie, instructing his men to take him to the woods and kill him. At the critical moment, Venom appeared, now bonded with Anne, and easily defeated all the guards. Venom transferred back to Eddie and warned him that Riot was incredibly strong, armed with multiple weapons, and that they had to stop Drake before he brought more symbiotes to Earth. Eddie and Venom headed toward the rocket launch site. On the way, Venom told Eddie, "I don't want the symbiotes to come to Earth. They'll destroy it effortlessly. I was a failure on my planet, but here I'm strong and I've started to like your world." When they arrived at the launch site, only 5 minutes remained until takeoff. Drake realized the scientist was trying to stop the launch and ordered Riot to kill him and destroy the controls. Riot advanced toward the rocket, while Venom attempted to stop him. A fierce battle erupted between Venom and Riot, with Riot demonstrating his overwhelming strength, striking Venom with his weapons and tearing him apart. At one point, Riot managed to trap Venom and Eddie inside his body. The rocket was seconds from launch when it activated a device emitting high-frequency noise, separating Riot from Drake and Venom from Eddie. Drake confronted Eddie directly, but Riot rebonded with Drake and stabbed Eddie from behind. Riot then boarded the rocket, ready for takeoff. As Eddie lay on the ground, Venom returned, rebonded with him, and revived him. Venom leaped onto the rocket, slicing it in half. The rocket exploded, killing Drake and Riot in the flames. Sadly, Venom was pulled into the fire and disappeared, while Eddie fell into the water and survived. Despite saving the world, Eddie was heartbroken over losing Venom. The next day, he sat with Anne, discussing his future. Eddie told her he had returned to his job as a journalist and tried to comfort him over Venom's loss. But it turned out Venom wasn't dead. He was still alive inside Eddie, communicating with him mentally. Eddie and Venom talked about setting ground rules for coexisting, like not eating random people and avoiding harming innocents. Venom agreed. That night, Eddie entered a convenience store to buy food. A robber broke into the store, and this time, Eddie decided to intervene. Venom appeared, grabbed the robber, and bit off his head. Eddie bid the shopkeeper farewell and left. In the final scene, Eddie visited a high-security prison to interview a notorious serial killer named Cletus Kasady and write his life story.